Hey everybody, it's Matthew, and it's a beautiful day, and I was in Hare Camp Park, and I thought, what the hell, let's talk about contract terminations. So we've had a lot of questions, and it's seemingly a lot of problems recently with the uptick in production. There's inevitably going to be transactions that fall through. It's suck it up buttercup kind of world. It's going to happen. How we handle ourselves and how we handle the transaction after termination becomes pretty important. And it seems like we've got a lot of misunderstandings in the industry and in our region about what that means and how do I properly terminate a contract and what do we do with escrow? So here's a couple things. First and foremost, let's start with escrow. Escrow can only be released to the client with mutual consent. Buyer and seller have to agree. In the initial ratification of the contract, they agree to give it to the buyer as part of their closing costs if they perform. If they don't perform, it can only be released with another confirmation in writing from the seller saying, yes, give not only this money, but this amount of money to this party. Without that agreement, without them coming to a consensus and agreeing to that, then we have to either have a court order, or we can do interpleaders, or even broker discretion, which we rarely use because, generally speaking, a client who says, don't give the money back, has made the determination and I can't force them to do otherwise. Only then can we release it once they go to the court. Now that's a pretty quick review of escrow. What is happening is that people are either not depositing it, or maybe it's a short sale and you're saying, I elect to receive the escrow after third-party approval and deposit it. And that used to be a cool thing. But nowadays they're happening quicker, they're more sure to happen, and we're having lots of problems with people remembering the deposit and the buyer not doing so. So I say get the escrow during ratification, regardless whether it's short sale or anything else. But whether you get the escrow or whether you don't, you still need a release of the promise to perform in the escrow. So even if they haven't made the deposit, the seller still has to release the obligation of the buyer to perform on delivery of the escrow. So when we have a contract that goes south, and again they do, we have two things that have to happen. One is a release of the contract, but that is separate than a release of the escrow. Two different issues, which is why we have two different forms in NVAR library. So if I'm going to terminate a contract, the proper way to do it is to get the notice of voiding contract, as well as the agreement to release contract and the escrow. Two different forms have to be delivered to the other side, and the seller has to release both. Now the notice to void the contract or terminate the contract is unilateral, which means the buyer sends it to the seller and says, we declare that we have terminated the contract. Getting the escrow release is a whole different issue and requires the written consent. At the moment that the party has, the buyer or seller has said, we no longer performing, we're done with this contract. You want to get that in writing. So if the other agent simply calls you, acknowledge the phone call, respond to them in email and go, here's what I believed you to say. Please let me know if I'm wrong. And give them maybe till 5 o'clock that night or the next day to let you know if you misunderstand. If they don't correct you or they confirm that it's a termination, it's a termination. The contract's done. The fact that we haven't released escrow is an entirely different issue. Don't penalize your sellers by not putting it back in the market, and certainly don't put these silly phrases like pending release. The contract's terminated, there is no pending the release, it is in fact released. The argument of the escrow is a whole separate issue and needs to be dealt with appropriately. So if I have a client and they just won't come to terms with the release of who's giving the money up in the escrow, that's a separate fight. You can enter into a contract with a different buyer for that same property. And if you're on the other side and you happen to look at it and say, oh, I saw they put the house back active in MLS, that is not a release. That is them simply looking for a buyer to limit the damages to the seller. The conflict between the two parties with the escrow needs to be dealt with through negotiations and getting your broker involved that they won't release. But we can't give the money back, and neither can the other side, until both parties agree in writing. So again, when you've got a contract that's terminated, there are two things that have to be done. One is send over the notice to terminate, saying we hereby terminate, and here's a paragraph why. And the second one is to request the release of the escrow. That's a ransom issue that if the seller refuses to sign, doesn't affect the marketability of the property, they have the right to do so. And your buyer and seller should be consulting legal advice or legal counsel in order what to do next. If the seller refuses to release, they need to go talk, the buyer needs to talk to an attorney. If you're working with a seller who says, I'm not going to release, but it's clear they should also talk to an attorney about the wisdom of doing so, because there could actually be damage and legal remedies from a seller who refuses to release, although he should in the contract. So that's just a few minutes talking about this release issue. As always, consult your brokers, give me a call if you have any questions, and hopefully your transactions go through and you don't have to deal with this issue. But if you do, as we all do, please make sure that you know exactly where your client stands and that you're not penalizing them unnecessarily by misinformation. Thanks so much. And as always, you know how to reach me, and you can give me an email if you have any questions.